All right, thank you everybody for coming today. Hopefully you'll learn a lot of good information about flood insurance in general, whether it's private or public sector. So to start us off, here is a picture of a river unimpeded by humans, left to its own devices. So you can see the main channel of the river, and there's my laser pointer. Yeah, so here's the main channel of the river. It's fairly obvious. This is the Keokuk River in Alaska, and I chose this picture of the river because it perfectly demonstrates how rivers behave and meander over time in their natural habitat left alone. So some things I wanted to point out here is this is the current river's edge, but you can clearly see all of these arcs where the river bend used to be. And over time, this bend has gotten bendier. So has this bend. Pretty much all of the river bends in the river will get bendier over time, and eventually sometimes they will cut off and form what's called an oxbow lake, and then the river will kind of straighten out again and then over time start bending again. So it is natural for rivers to meander. It's natural for them to move. They do not stay put naturally. So here is a screenshot of downtown Keene. And I wanted to point out that there is evidence of a meandering river here in Keene. Right here, we have an oxbow lake, which used to be a river bend. And down here, we have another active river bend in the river, as well as some shopping centers very close by. And left to its own devices, this bend right here would likely continue to erode southeastward into the shopping center. Now, this is a very good demonstration of why having flood insurance would be important, is because over time, the river will naturally start eroding and getting closer to that building. All right, so I'm going to talk about the types of flooding that you can see. Not all floods are alike. So the first type of flooding is called river and inland flooding. This is what you're most familiar with. It is when the river water gets really high and comes up and over the riverbanks. This is most of the time due to excessive rainfall, persistent thunderstorms, or snow melt, essentially any weather phenomenon that adds water to the ground. And these weather phenomenons tend to be long duration, meaning, well, not necessarily all the time, but tends to be more predictable, because the larger the weather event, the more signals it has that it's coming. And since this is originating from the river, the water usually spreads out along the mapped floodplain, and it's easier to plan for because you know where the flood's going to go. And rivers span multiple towns, in some cases multiple states or countries, and can have very large areas of impact. Now, another type of flooding that you're very familiar with here in southwest New Hampshire is flash flooding, especially over the last several summers. These are caused by excessive rainfall in very short periods of time, generally less than 6 hours, and they are characterized as high-velocity torrents of water after heavy rains that rip through the riverbeds, urban streets, and mountain canyons. These are short duration, lasting minutes to hours, and have a very small but very intense area of impact. And eventually the floodwaters will drain into the rivers and the floodplain, but it can originate anywhere, even if you're on top of a hill. Anywhere it can rain, you can have a flash flood. And that inherently leads to lower predictability, and they are harder to plan for. And on the pictures here, I have the top picture is sediment that has been eroded, and the river essentially jumped the banks the water channel carved through this person's front yard. And I don't have a picture of where that sediment went, but when sediment gets removed somewhere, it needs to be deposited somewhere else. And so the bottom picture is an intersection in Alexandria, New Hampshire from 2023 in July, and that is a stop sign. That is 4 to 5 feet of gravel that was deposited on the road over the course of an hour. So, yeah, flash floods are very, very devastating. I know I don't need to remind anyone of that here because I know you've seen a lot of it, but yeah. And the last type of flooding that you guys tend to see in southwest New Hampshire, well, occasionally, is ice jam flooding. And this is when you have chunks of river ice that crack and pile up and essentially just pile up on a narrow channel of the river and blocks the flow of water, making that water quickly rise upstream of that jam, and then it floods the surrounding area. And these inherently, because they're caused by a random pileup of ice, is low predictability, variable duration. It persists as long as that ice jam is there. And usually, since it tends to be along a river, it will spread out along the river's mapped floodplain. And also, because it is a river, it still has a very large area of impact. And this is just a series of images from an ice jam flooding in Alaska, where the ice jam was off screen to the right, and then the water just piled up, and if this was a town right here, the entire downtown would be flooded. All right, so I'm going to use many acronyms today. So I'm going to start off so you know what they all mean. NFIP is the National Flood Insurance Program. I will be generally just referring to it as the NFIP. FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. FIRM is the Flood Insurance Rate Map. That is your official legal map of the floodplain from FEMA, and that is what your regulations are based off of. There's also the Flood Insurance Study, or FIS, FIS, some people call it FIS, some spell it out. This is the flood insurance study that goes along with the map. It is essentially a table of water elevations that engineers can use. And then there's something called the Community Rating System, or CRS. This is an additional program that you can opt into in the National Flood Insurance Program that provides additional discounted insurance premiums for any policyholder in that community. All right, and then 2 definitions. BFE is base flood elevation. That is the elevation of the surface water resulting from a flood that is a 1% chance of equaling or exceeding that level in any given year. I just noticed that spelling mistake. That's supposed to say chance. And then SFHA, Special Flood Hazard Area. That is the portion of the floodplain which is subject to inundation by the base flood. That is essentially the area that your local floodplain regulations apply to. Alrighty, so an overview of the NFIP. What is it? It was created by Congress in 1968. It is a voluntary partnership between FEMA and participating communities. And generally we kind of refer to it as a 3-legged stool because there's 3 main parts of it. There is the floodplain mapping, which gives you your floodplain maps. Then you build your floodplain regulations off of those maps. And then you can provide flood insurance in your community. It doesn't have to be only if you're in the floodplain. Any participating community can offer flood insurance to their entire community. So the NFIP is voluntary. Communities essentially agree with FEMA to adopt local floodplain regulations and enforce them through a local permitting process. Then Then the NFIP flood insurance is available for purchase for all property owners in the community. We have excellent participation here in New Hampshire. All of these white communities are participating in the program. We have a couple that are non-participating, a couple that have been suspended and are getting back in the program, and then we also have a bunch of unincorporated places. Now, those areas, we don't have any here in Southwest New Hampshire, but those areas can still participate through the county that they're in. Alrighty, so some roles and responsibilities if you are participating in the NFIP. So the NFIP is FEMA's program, and they are overseeing the program at the federal level. FEMA's responsibilities are to make flood insurance available for purchase for any participating communities. FEMA also does risk identification, essentially creating the floodplain maps. They oversee the NFIP and establish development and building standards and provide many guidance documents, which I have brought some in the back table for you to take. FEMA also monitors compliance because they need to make sure everyone participating in the program is meeting their minimum regulations. So, what do we do at the state? Me and my coworker Stephanie. We provide technical assistance to all stakeholders, whether that is community officials or residents or state officials. We provide education and outreach, such as this presentation we're doing tonight. We also provide model floodplain regulations that communities can use to build their floodplain management regulations off of. And we also assist communities in evaluating the compliance of floodplain activities and post-disaster activities. Now, community responsibilities. It is the responsibility of the community to understand your own community's regulations and FEMA maps. It is also your responsibility to ensure that local permits are applied for and all development in the SFHA is compliant within the community. You should be reviewing and processing your permit applications for floodplain development, as well as ensuring that floodplain development is built according to approved permits and floodplain regulations. And if the chance comes along where a development is not consistent with your community's regulations, it is the community's responsibility to take enforcement actions and correct that violation. Otherwise, FEMA will find it eventually and will come knocking to fix it. All right, so let's talk about our floodplain maps. So the flood insurance rate map, or FIRM, what is it? It is your official floodplain map that designates the area that needs to be regulated according to the FEMA minimum NFIP standards. It is developed by FEMA using detailed surveying, engineering, hydrologic, and hydraulic analysis. And it tells you the area of land expected to be flooded during the 1% annual chance flood. It also tells you what flood zone an area is in, as well as the base flood elevation and many other details. But those are the big ones. And it is, as I've said this a couple times now, but the floodplain map is, or the flood insurance rate map is the official designation for your community's regulations. And just a brief note, some of the most common flood zones that you will be seeing are Zone A and AE. Those are all inland. Any zone starting with an A is inland. The AE zones used to be referred to as A1 through 30. That is being retired and replaced with the general just AE zone. There's also AO and AH, which are kind of special flood zones where it's like behind a dune and it's just shallow flooding or shallow ponding. But the most common ones you'll come across are A and AE. The V zones are essentially the same but coastal. Alrighty, so here is a picture of what the flood insurance rate map looks like. This is taken in Concord, and I want to highlight a couple things. So every area that is blue here is the 1% annual chance special flood hazard area. Essentially, all the blue areas are where you need to regulate your floodplain. Now, the red, or not red, the kind of brownish orangey areas are what used to be called the 500-year floodplain that is now being called the 0.2% annual chance special flood hazard area. This is, communities are able to adopt higher regulations and essentially regulate development in the 500-year floodplain, and sometimes if your community is participating in that CRS program, your community can get additional discounted insurance for regulating the 500-year floodplain, but that is not necessary if you are just in the basic regular NFIP program. And the last thing I wanted to highlight, or not the last thing, but one other thing I wanted to highlight on this slide is the floodway. That is this striped area of the river. That is the main channel of the river that will have the highest velocity and highest flow of water during the 100-year flood and, or 1% chance, annual chance flood. And that is essentially, the regulations say that you should not have any development in the floodway, and if there is development in the floodway, it has to be associated with a detailed hydrologic and engineering analysis that shows that there will be zero raise in floodwaters due to that construction. It cannot even be an inch. So the last things I wanted to highlight on this slide are, well, I'll do that once more so you can see. The yellow areas are all indications of the BFE, the base flood elevation. Now that will change as you go upriver. That water level will rise as the elevation rises. So there are cross sections across the river, such as this one right here, and right along that cross section, it will say the exact height of that base flood elevation, and sometimes in areas where you have just like a pond, that entire area will be encompassed in one base flood elevation. Now I know you're not coastal, but this is a great example of different flood zones. So I took a screenshot here of Rye, and we have this large area of floodplain and then a small area of the 500-year floodplain. And there are 6 flood zones in this picture. So I guess, well, first one is just your regular AE zone. That's your inland your inland flooding with a base flood elevation. Then you have the 500-year or 0.2% annual chance flood area. There's also, all of these are the indications of the different flood zones. So we have a zone AO here. This is a zone VE with an elevation of 20 feet. This is a zone VE with an elevation of 14 feet. And this is a zone VE with elevation 18 feet. So all of those are considered different flood zones. And the floodplain maps are very complicated. FEMA will do routine updates to these floodplain maps to essentially account for changes in soil permeability due to development, changes in the river meandering, changes in the water cycle itself. There's a lot of things that can change the floodplain. And FEMA is currently in the process of updating the floodplain maps for pretty much the entire state of New Hampshire. And the timeline of the mapping update process takes many years. I know Cheshire County, I believe, just had their preliminary maps released and should be having a meeting very soon about that. And this is the exact, or the timeline showing each of the steps in the mapping process, which can be broken down into essentially 3 categories. You have your map, your data collection, and then there's the map development. And then finally, you can move on to map adoption. Now, the data collection can take up to 2 or 3 years, depending on funding and resources, or just the complexity of the floodplain. Then the map development, FEMA will issue a preliminary map, check with the community. If there's issues, the community will send the map back, and there will be multiple revisions. And eventually, over ideally a year or 2 or 3, FEMA will ultimately decide this map is as accurate as it will be for current purposes and publish. Now, the publication is initiated by a letter of final determination. That is the community's notice that within 6 months, the community must update the floodplain maps referenced in their ordinance to reflect the new maps. And once at 6 months after receipt of that letter, the maps get published, and if your community has not adopted the new maps by then, FEMA may consider suspending the community temporarily, hopefully, but FEMA has done that in the past, will not hesitate to do it again. Yes?
Given the speed that climate change is progressing, is some of this data old before it even comes out as the final?
So, to a certain extent, yes. Essentially, so if there was a floodplain map published today, it would not factor in any flooding that happened over this last summer because the map was pretty much finalized at that point. So the purpose of the map is to show the current conditions of the floodplain. It is not trying to forecast what the future floodplain looks like. It is only showing what it looks like right now on the date it's published.
Yeah, I'm just looking at your chart saying years 1 and 2 you're collecting, but year 5 you're publishing. So there's a 3-year gap there. That's what I'm asking about.
Yeah. So
I want it to be better. It's probably not.
yeah. It takes about $10,000 to $15,000 to survey a single mile of river. Yeah. And there's a lot of river across the US, and so there are still communities in northern Maine that still have their original maps from the 1970s. So at least we're very lucky where we're getting new maps right now. All right, so this is an example here of what the new maps can look like. So, well, this right here is a screenshot of the current floodplain maps. I believe this is the Kentucky River, I'm not positive. But you have the floodway, you have the floodplain alongside it, and then there's an area here that is kind of low-lying wetlands. And here is a preliminary map of what the new map looks like. I'll kind of go back and forth. You can see that the edges of the floodplain have a lot more definition. That's because we've just got better surveying now. And there's areas that have been added to the floodplain, and there's areas that have been removed from the floodplain. And that kind of shows you that the floodplain will change over time. So I know you're all anxious to hear when you're getting the new maps. So this is a little map I put together to kind of show you where each of the watersheds are in the process. So the years are saying when you should expect the new maps to be published. Hopefully, fingers crossed, that resources stay what they are. Those dates are subject to change, and they likely will change, but that is the current estimate. And all the areas in blue are still in the data collection process. All the areas in yellow they have received preliminary maps. And then the area here in green is in the process of revising the preliminary maps. And the areas in pink, the maps have been finalized and settled on, and they are just waiting on that letter to be published. And I also put some information and resources over to the right on how you can look up your new maps, especially also with some directions on how to navigate the FEMA site, because it is not super user-friendly. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some floodplain regulations. So we have here at the State Office of Planning and Development, we have state model ordinances that we can provide on request to communities. Now, they are dependent on what flood zones your community has, which is why we don't just have them up on the website, because you need to make sure you're looking at the right one for your community. We also have a higher standards model ordinance, as well as different resources for building requirements. So I've kind of talked a little bit about this, that the NFIP requires participating communities to adopt and enforce the minimum NFIP regulations, and it is the community's responsibility for understanding those regulations and enforcing their ordinance, and then correcting any violations if they come about. Now, our model ordinances that we have at the state have been approved by FEMA, so if your community adopts the model ordinance pretty much as is, you should know that, or be confident that your community's ordinances should be in full compliance. And then this is just a screenshot of what our model ordinance looks like. It has insert town name, where you pretty much can just fill it out and then send it back to me so I can review it and make sure you did it right, and then should be able to move forward with adoption. All right, so the community has a process of adopting and enforcing floodplain management regulations, and this is to allow development in the floodplain to happen, because we are in a highly developed area of the country. We don't have a lot of free open space left, so we do need some rules on how to build in the floodplain to a level of safety. Just wanted to make sure everyone knows that your community's regulations pertain to all development in the floodplain, even if that homeowner doesn't actually have flood insurance and they don't have an NFIP or a private insurance policy. They still have to follow the community's local floodplain regulations. All right, so we have a menu of higher standards at the state that has essentially optional additional regulations or projects your community can adopt to increase the flood resilience of the community, such as requiring higher freeboard, which is the distance between the base flood elevation and the base of the house. You could also regulate the 0.2% annual chance flood area, formerly known as the 500-year floodplain. That is one of the higher standards that we highly encourage more developed areas to use. And we have a menu of higher standards that you can look up on our website to use, and it's essentially just pick and choose which ones you think your community would be able to handle. So development is allowed in the floodplain most of the time, at least if you're just using the minimum NFIP regulations. And it is allowed when it's done correctly, and it depends on the community's floodplain management regulations. And FEMA has a very large definition, or a broad definition of development. It is any man-made change to the special flood hazard area, which includes regular structure development as well as drilling, grading, paving, mining, excavation, filling of storage and equipment, or filling and storage of equipment or materials. So I'm not going to go super in depth on the building requirements, but these are the main ones to be aware of. So the lowest floor, including the basement, a lot of people get that confused. It is not the first floor, it's the lowest floor. Must be at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation. That is due to the state of New Hampshire's state building code. The FEMA regulations will say you need to build to the base flood elevation, but the state of New Hampshire, we have a requirement that says you need to build 1 foot higher than that. They're also, if you do have an enclosure below the base flood elevation, it cannot be like a finished basement with a TV and whatever you want in there. It has to be flood-proofed or designed and adequately anchored to prevent flotation, collapse, and lateral movement. And I'll go into, in the next slide, what that kind of means. But essentially, that area really needs to have nothing in it that can't get wet. And if no base flood elevation is available, because we do have a lot of zone A's here in New Hampshire that are designated as a floodplain, but we don't have a base flood elevation data. So there's two ways you can go about this. Either the homeowner can pay a surveyor to determine a BFE for them. That tends to be fairly expensive. Or, and what we recommend here at the state is to require the lowest floor to be elevated at least 2 feet above the highest adjacent grade. And we've checked that with FEMA. FEMA's okay with us using that in areas where there is no BFE. And that is the least cost prohibitive option for people. So I wanted to talk about flood openings and why they're important and what they're supposed to do. So basements and enclosures below the base flood elevation have to have flood openings, and they have to have 1 square inch of flood opening for every 1 square foot of enclosed space. And here's where people get mixed up. The openings are supposed to allow water into the basement during the flood to equalize the water pressure inside and outside the foundation to prevent that foundation from failing. Then after the flood recedes, then your sump pump would pump the water back out. It is a common misconception that the flood vents are supposed to keep the water out during the flood. You don't want that. Otherwise, your basement's going to fail. And you need to equalize that water pressure because water has a lot of force behind it. So,
I live in an old house. I have some half cellars as part of my foundation. How does that work?
So it depends on how, so ideally your house is fully compliant, and if it is old, there's a chance that it was what we call pre-firm, essentially built before there was a floodplain map, and that there's no requirement for you to do anything about your basement or the crawl space right now, but the next slide, there is something you need to be aware of. But first, there are a couple things, special rules, I guess, for RVs and manufactured homes. I'm gonna start off with RVs. So RVs are allowed as long as they're on site fewer than 180 consecutive days, or they must be fully licensed and ready for highway use, which means it must be on its wheels or a jacking system, which is attached to the site only by quick disconnect utilities and has no permanently attached additions. So you don't build a deck off of your RV. And then if that's not the case, if it is a permanent RV, then we're essentially going to say that is a manufactured home because it is serving all the purposes of a manufactured home. Now, the rules for a manufactured home are that it must be elevated on a permanent foundation with the lowest floor at or above the base flood elevation. And it also must be securely anchored to the ground. So, what about those grandfathered properties? They were around before you had floodplain regulations. So there are a couple things to be aware of. There's something called a substantial improvement and another thing called substantial damage. That essentially means any reconstruction, rehabilitation, or addition, or other improvements that the total cost equals more than 50% equals or exceeds 50% of the market value of that structure before the start of construction. And essentially, if you significantly increase the value of your house, then FEMA and your community is going to essentially consider that a new construction, and at that point, the entirety of the structure will have to be brought into full compliance. Now, substantial damage, similar rule. If it was damaged by more than half of its market value and the cost of constructions to bring it back to what it was would be more than half its value, then that would again be essentially considered a new construction and have to follow all of the current floodplain regulations in the community. Does that answer your question earlier?
Yeah, sort of.
Okay.
I like the idea of equalizing the water pressure in and out of the house. It makes sense. I don't remember anybody talking about that.
A lot of people will just say that you need flood vents, but then not actually tell you why. And that's why I wanted to make that clarification there. One last thing about substantial improvement in damage is that determination is done by the community. Essentially, when the community receives a building permit, they need to be aware of the cost of that development and essentially be mindful of, is this a significant improvement? The community ultimately makes that determination. So there's a couple ways you can document compliance. One of the most useful documents you can have is what's called an elevation certificate. This is a form that essentially certifies all of the as-built elevation data for all new construction and substantial improvements. And some communities require an elevation certificate for all construction. Some communities will require it for a substantial improvement. And ultimately, an elevation certificate is your best tool for checking final construction heights to determine if a structure is compliant. Now, the elevation certificate, it only certifies the heights of the BFE, the highest adjacent grade, the lowest floor, but it does not certify compliance. It's up to the community to then check all of those elevations and make sure they're consistent with the community's regulations. But the elevation certificate is ultimately, if anything goes to court, that's what's going to be used and checked to verify if something's compliant or not. Alrighty, so there are some circumstances where a relief is needed from the community's floodplain regulations. You can do that through a variance. It is a local decision, and there are 3 NFIP criteria and 5 state criteria that must be met in order to essentially accept the variance. And if you do issue a variance, documentation is your community's only protection. If that structure that you granted a variance for happens to cause damage in the future, just document everything. That is your best protection. Alrighty, so the last few things I wanted to touch on were your insurance premiums and kind of how that is calculated through the NFIP. So there is a new-ish risk rating methodology. It was really started in 2023, and this new methodology accounts for the location of your building, whether or how far it is to flooding sources, whether or not you're in a CRS community and there can be an additional discount on your premium. It also will include the contents and the use of the building, whether it's a residential and you have people sleeping there, which proves a larger risk than if it's a commercial, non-residential. Hopefully people aren't there in the middle of the night sleeping. It also takes into account construction, the number of stories. So if you're on an apartment on the 19th floor, you're premium will probably be lower than the first floor. All right, so the CRS is an additional voluntary program that provides additional discounts to any NFIP policyholder in that community, and communities can essentially adopt higher than the minimum regulations, and they're awarded different amounts of points for different activities, and essentially once you reach like 500 points, then you can offer a 5% discount. If you reach 1,000 points, you can offer a 10% discount. That's kind of how it works. And the prerequisites of being in the community rating system is you have to already have been in the NFIP program for at least a year. And we just had our quarterly meeting this afternoon, right before this. And then we do have CRS meetings every quarter. So if you are a community official looking to join, those meetings are a great opportunity to learn more. All right, so the benefits of the National Flood Insurance Program is there are many insurance options that we're going to hear from later, and the NFIP can, but not always, be more affordable. It really depends on where you are and what your risk is. And then additionally, on top of that, being in the NFIP program, your community would then be eligible for additional discounts through the CRS program. There are also some grants that are only available to communities participating in the NFIP. And yeah, so those are just some of the benefits of the NFIP. And the main takeaways I wanted to leave us off with are that flooding is a risk that exists throughout the state, regardless of if you're next to the river or if you're on the mountaintop. Anywhere it can rain, it can flood. And there are many flood insurance options, one of which is the NFIP, as well as many private insurance options. And then the floodplain management regulations at least with the NFIP, it's voluntary for the community to join, but FEMA has minimum standards communities have to meet, and the community agrees to adopt and enforce those regulations. And also that building in the floodplain or development in the floodplain, it is allowed, but there are rules and considerations to keep in mind. And yeah, ultimately the goal of the NFIP as well as regular flood insurance is just to mitigate the risks of flooding and increase community preparedness. And I have some resources here. I believe the slides will be sending those out afterwards, so you can have all these links. These are some of the resources that we have at OPD, as well as some of the resources provided through FEMA. And here are the contacts for me, Sarah Thunberg. My coworker, Stephanie Frechette, is also one of the NFIP coordinators. She couldn't be here tonight, but this is our contact information if you have any further questions or want to reach out to us. Do we want to do questions now or just? Okay, yeah, so we'll do some more questions at the end. So I'm going to pass it off to Luann King.
I'm not Luann, but that's okay. I'm AJ Kirsten. I'm the Consumer Outreach Coordinator with the New Hampshire Insurance Department. I just want to say a couple things before Luann takes the stage. She's going to talk about some private flood insurance programs, but I wanted to raise awareness of our Consumer Services Division. So the New Hampshire Insurance Department regulates commercially sold insurance. So you figure anything the federal government doesn't regulate. We don't regulate New Hampshire, the National Flood Insurance Program, Medicare, or Medicaid. Basically anything else, we are a point of contact and a free resource. On the back table, I'll probably pass them out later on during the Q&A, are cards with more information on how we can help. We have an in-house call center called the Consumer Services Division. If you have denial, cancellation, not sure where to turn, I don't remember where to get NFIP coverage, there's no wrong door. We will point you in the right direction to be able to get the coverage you need. And we also provide educational opportunities like this, or working with other government agencies for various community organizations. So please don't hesitate to reach out. My card is in the back, as well as some other resources on what the insurance department does. And with that, I'm going to throw it to Luann King, who is our supervisor for property and casualty compliance, to talk about private flood insurance coverage.
Thank you, AJ. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the presentation, and that was a really good presentation. There was a lot of information there. We're going to pivot a little bit and just now focus, instead of on all the information that you gave, we're going to focus a little bit more on insurance. There are, as mentioned, a couple different insurance options. You can choose the NFIP route, you can choose the private insurance route, and there's nothing wrong with having both, and there's advantages to having both, which I'm about to get into. Let's just start with some important flood facts that not everyone is aware of. Floods are the most common natural hazard in the United States, with causes ranging from heavy precipitation to hurricanes, winter storms, and snow melt. Some of the worst ones we've had have occurred during the winter months when the ground is frozen and can't accept the water, and it doesn't take very much and whammo, you got a flood. Over the past 50 years, Americans have seen a 20% increase in the heaviest downpours. The size of the nation's floodplains will likely grow by 40 to 45% over the next 90 years. And a lot of that has to do with what you were outlining as well, with the river changing courses. 99% of the U.S. counties have been impacted by a flooding event since 1996. Over the course of a 30-year mortgage, homeowners in the 100-year floodplain have a 1 in 4 chance or greater of being flooded, which is twice the probability that they will experience a fire loss. Floods can happen everywhere. People outside the high-risk area or the 100-year floodplain file over 20% of the flood insurance claims and receive 1/3 of disaster assistance for flooding. Flood coverage is generally excluded from all homeowners and renters policies, including condos. You won't find an insurance policy that says, yep, I'm going to cover flood, not a regular homeowner, renters, or condo policy. You'll need...
A little slower and louder, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is this on?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, I'm sorry. Can you hear me? Is this better? Oh, that is better. Okay. Yeah, I just assumed I was talking it was as clear as yours because I didn't know. Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay. So flood coverage, this is really important. It's excluded from all of your homeowners, renters, and condo policies. You need a flood policy of some sort to get that coverage. There are some endorsements that you can put on a homeowners or commercial policy, but a flood policy itself is going to give you the best, broadest protection. So you should talk with your lender and your insurance agent to determine if you need a flood insurance policy. And I just want to emphasize, if you need a flood insurance policy, there's no way of looking in a crystal ball and knowing who is going to be flooded. So I think everyone needs a flood insurance policy. That's my opinion. They are required, flood policies are required if you have a federally backed mortgage lender and you live in a high-risk flood zone, so you will absolutely be required to have that in order to close on your property when you have a federally backed mortgage, and that is going to be the NFIP program that was discussed. You should consider your risk tolerance and your location, and your agent is going to be your best resource as far as what's available, what you can afford, how much coverage you should have, and so forth. And now we're going to dive in a little bit the differences between the NFIP and the private options available. At the insurance department, my team, what we do is we read all of the insurance forms that insurance companies want to offer to consumers in the state of New Hampshire. And our role is to make sure that they're compliant with all of the New Hampshire statutes and rules. So I can tell you that we have read all of the private flood policies that are available for purchase in New Hampshire, And there are quite a few different options. This is why it's always important that you talk to your agent to find out and compare your coverages. Are they paying you on a replacement cost basis, or are they just paying actual cash value? All of these things your agent will be able to help you with, and they'll find the carrier that is going to give you the coverage at the level that you need at the price that you can afford. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the NFIP from an insurance standpoint. It's federally regulated and subsidized, and it's required if you live in the high-risk area and have a federally backed mortgage. The average premium, this is an average premium, is $600 to $700 annually. Yours could be more or less. What's really important is the NFIP program caps out at $250,000 for the dwelling protection and $100,000 for contents. In this day and age, that might not be adequate, and that is why I said you might benefit from not only having the NFIP, which you might be required to have, but you might want to layer an excess private flood policy on top of that to maybe bridge that gap. Maybe your house is $400,000, you want that extra $150,000. That would be where you would buy that private flood policy. Just for it would be called an excess policy. NFIP will come in at the primary level, pay its policy limits, and then if you still had existing damage, your private policy would come in above that. And again, looking at the contents, $100,000 is the maximum that NFIP offers. I think a lot of us, if we go around our house and we add up our appliances and our furniture and all this, we're going to come up with more than $100,000. And if you live on one floor, then you might be looking at needing more coverage, more insurance coverage. Loss of use isn't available for the NFIP program, so when you're displaced and you have to stay somewhere else, if it's a hotel or wherever it is, your private policy is going to provide loss of use or additional living expense coverage, and the NFIP policy does not provide that. The NFIP policy has a 30-day waiting period. You start your policy today. In 30 days, that's when your coverage becomes effective. If you have a flood between now and then, you're in the waiting period and it's not eligible. So now on the other side of the coin, the private flood insurance, that's going to be sold by your for-profit companies, so they're looking to make a profit. That depends on, and they have to have reinsurance. Reinsurance is insurance for insurance companies, so they're willing to write a policy as long as they know that in the event of a catastrophe, which is going to be pretty widespread and affect a lot of policies, they're backed by another reinsurance company. So that's important from a solvency standpoint, and not to get too off topic, but the insurance department, we also have a unit that makes sure that any insurance company that writes in the state of New Hampshire meets its financial obligations and stays solvent. So if you have admitted, so when you talk to your insurance agent, you want to go with an admitted company, which means that they have already gone through all of the vetting process with the New Hampshire Insurance Department for solvency, which means that they have done their homework and have reinsurance, so they will not go belly up and leave you high and dry. So private flood insurance covers your dwelling, it covers other structures on the premise, it covers loss of use, resiliency, and contents. Okay, the lights just went off. Should we be worried? No, for real. Is there anything we should know about?
It's just sensors.
Oh, it's just, okay. I didn't want to be like locked in.
No, you're good.
Oh, okay,
Yeah, we're good.
So the private flood insurance options, they offer the higher limits and actually enhanced coverages. They could be broader coverages, and they could include different enhancements within the policy that the NFIP program doesn't offer. There is usually no waiting period. Some private carriers have a 14-day waiting period, less than the 30 that the NFIP offers. And it can provide broader protection at better rates. Then now we're going to talk a little bit about being prepared for the flood. We all should do this, regardless if you have flood insurance or not. If you have a home, if you have an apartment, if you have stuff, you should keep a home inventory. It can be, if you're a paper person, you can write it on an inventory sheet. There are some, if you just Google or do an internet search for home inventories, there's samples that you can type them out and print them, or print them and write on them. Spreadsheets, photos, videos, digital solutions. Like I said, the NAIC has an inventory app available online for free. What I recommend everybody doing, if you have a cell phone, you just put it on video and you literally just walk around your house very slowly. You open drawers, closets, you go into the basement, into the attic, into that garage where you have the seasonal stuff so that you don't always think about everything, because I don't know that we could all sit down and write everything that we own without having such an inventory. That's going to be important after a loss because you need to prove what was there, and you also need to document the value of it so that the policy can then respond accordingly. Go room to room, like I said, closets, attics, garages, basements, storage units. Keep receipts if you buy something relatively expensive, maybe jewelry, appliances, that type of thing. You should keep your receipts. Again, a digital copy if you take pictures of them on your cell phone or videos. My cell phone backs up automatically to the cloud, so even if my phone is destroyed in a flood, I have a way to get access to all of that. If you do the paper inventory or another form of an inventory, keep a copy of it at least off-site, either in a safety deposit box at a bank, maybe a friend's house, a relative's house. Don't keep your only copy in the house. And then this is something that you should probably consider updating regularly. You know, if you do a renovation, your kitchen renovation, so now you have new appliances, then you need to redo your inventory, your video, or your paper inventory. So after a flood has happened, an insurance policy is a contract between two entities, you, the insured, and the insurance company. Both of you have obligations. After a loss occurs, in this case a flood, you have responsibilities too, and you have to follow what your policy tells you have to do in order to not jeopardize losing your coverage. After a loss, when it's safe, you need to make contact with your insurance agent or your insurance company. You also have a requirement to prevent additional damage from happening. So if it's something that could be, you know, moved so that it doesn't sustain additional damage, you need to move it. If it's something that should be tarped, whatever the case may be, if it's reasonable and it prevents additional damage, you're responsible for doing that. But you don't have to really worry too much about that, because when you call your agent, they are an agent of the insurance company, and they will tell you step by step what you want, what they want you to do or what you need to do. And if they say, don't touch anything, don't touch anything. Don't throw it away until they tell you to, because they may not send out an adjuster if an entire area was devastated. That's going to be a lot of claims to settle. They might just have you take pictures or videos and send it to them, and they might say, fine, you can get rid of the damaged items at this point because they have the documentation that they need. Just don't assume that that's what they want you to do. Just wait for them to actually tell you it's okay to throw the stuff away, because anything damaged away, because if you just don't want to look at it and it's, you know, hurtful and you throw it away, but you don't have permission, you might not have coverage for that because they have not been able to verify that in their to their satisfaction. And then the last slide here has, and you're sending this out to everybody? Yeah. Yep, there's two more slides. This has a lot of really good, helpful websites. The FloodSmart is really comprehensive, the floodsmart.gov. If you go there, you're going to find a lot of information available. And then this is the last site I wanted to just, So the FloodSmart has a lot of information on the NFIPs from an insurance standpoint, and if you have questions about where do I go to get private flood coverage, your insurance agent that you have now for your home, apartment, or condo would also be a good resource. TrustedChoice.com is another one where you just go on that website, you put in your zip code and what you're looking for. In this case, it would be flood, and it will literally give you the contact information for your local agents that can provide information and policies for you. And I'd like to open it up now if there are any questions for either myself or for Sarah. And if there's no questions, I'll just let you know, like the insurance department, like AJ said, if you have any questions, and I mean this, I know tonight we're focusing on flood, but this is applicable to anything. If you have any questions on any insurance policy where you're not 100% sure, if you're not sure that you were treated fairly, if a claim was settled properly, if you have any questions, and I mean this, just give us a call. We are a free resource. I just want to plug a number, not this past fiscal year, but the fiscal year before that. We returned $6.2 or $6.4 million to New Hampshire consumers that otherwise would not have received that payment from insurance companies. And consumers call us, they're not sure about something, we launch an investigation. Insurance companies have a limited amount of time to respond to us, and we hold them accountable, whatever the statute or the rule says, and we make sure that you're treated fairly. So we are a resource if you have any questions. I'd like you to just remember us, not just for flood, but for any insurance. It can be personal or commercial. Tell your family and friends. And any questions at all for Sarah or myself?
I just wanted to say I forgot to put the resource in my slides, but there is also the flood insurance advocate for the National Flood Insurance Program. It is essentially like if you think your policy rating is unfair or unjust, or you're finding issues with your insurance through the NFIP, there is the NFIP insurance advocate, which I highly recommend that you check out if you are having issues with your policies.
Is that on FloodSmart?
I believe so. I believe that there's a specific page and email address for it, but I will be putting that in the next slides.